Hello, and welcome to Movieland. For this video, we're going to be talking about the top 5 episodes from the first season of Viper. Viper was an action-adventure show that debuted in January 1994 on the NBC network. After one season on network TV, the show jumped over to first-run syndication and ran for an additional 3 seasons. Now, the show's premise actually evolved quite a bit. The storylines were quite different from the first season on NBC versus the syndicated show. In the later syndicated seasons, the show was actually built around following a secret task force attached to the police department. Whereas the first season was based around kind of like the Batman or Airwolf premise, where it was this vigilante with this amazing crime-fighting vehicle. For the first season, the show followed a character named Joe Astor, and he was actually a reformed criminal, formerly known as Michael Payton, and he was basically trying to right the wrongs of the past and help people in the process. This was a fun, escapist action show from the 1990s, and it was one of the few car-related shows made during that era, so it was basically by itself, and it really stood out to me. I grew up with Knight Rider and Dukes of Hazzard and those type of shows, and this felt like that same type of action formula, only they were able to crank it up to like an 11, just because they had a bigger budget than those predecessors. I personally think the visual effects were amazing back in the day, and I still think they hold up pretty well considering their age. So one quick disclaimer before I start talking about the episodes. This video is 100% subjective. It's all opinions. I looked at the scores on Internet Movie Database, and I don't necessarily agree with how they rated which were the best episodes and which were the worst. I'm sharing with you what I thought were the best episodes of Viper as a longtime fan, and nothing beyond that. So here are my top 5 episodes of the first season of Viper, from worst to first. Number 5, Wheels of Fire. This episode was kind of a confluence of events, and I liked the complexity of the plot. The villain for this episode was a ruthless oil tycoon played by Bryan Cranston about 20 years before he became a legend on Breaking Bad. And I think the storyline kind of lifted elements from a movie I saw in the 80s called Tucker, A Man in His Dream. The film was about Preston Tucker, who is this legendary automotive inventor who created the 1948 Tucker torpedo. It was quite a groundbreaking car, but the big three at the time didn't want the competition, so they did everything in their power to basically destroy him. That's pretty much the same premise of this episode, only instead of Tucker, the inventor's name is now Baxley, and instead of the big three automakers destroying his breakthrough vehicle, it was actually Berlin Petroleum, the company that is actually run by Bryan Cranston's character. The episode opens with utility workers discovering the old Baxley car buried underneath the abandoned factory, and it's just a fun episode throughout. The pacing is great, and there's a lot of great car chases. There's a lot of Easter eggs for car guys in here too. For example, the Baxley is actually a replica of the old Lincoln Futura concept car that was, I think it was made in the 40s, and it eventually became the Batmobile for the 1960s Batman show with Adam West. And I do think that sequence with the red future being pursued by the Viper Defender in the show is one of the most iconic scenes of the entire first season. Seeing that old classic car weave in and out of traffic at high speeds is just incredible. And at the end of the episode, you had the oil tycoon jumping into his brand new Chrysler New Yorker and slide it around and jump in it and ended up crashing it in this huge explosion. So, that's something you would expect from a 1980s show, but by the mid-1990s when the show was out, there was nothing like it on TV. Number 4, Thief of Hearts. This episode was a real barn burner. Just packed with action from start to finish. I genuinely believe this was intended to be the season 1 finale because they pulled out all the stops for it. I just think NBC probably aired it out of order because the last episode of the season was Crown of Thorns. When Viper was broadcast over in Europe, Thief of Hearts was indeed the season 1 finale, and it just makes a lot of sense to air it in that order. They absolutely beat the hell out of the car in this episode. It gets hit by like a half dozen rockets and just absolutely pummeled with machine guns for the whole episode, and it's barely running by the end. So it was just weird because NBC then, played the episode Crown of Thorns the following week, and the car is absolutely flawless and perfect. It just didn't really make sense. It's going to take time to repair just the significant damage that was inflicted in Thief of Hearts. The story for this episode is pretty straightforward. It was about criminals selling body parts. In this particular case, it was a heart. The heart had been donated to a child that was basically going to die without it, and a billionaire basically came in and paid a few criminals to steal it. So the storyline's pretty straightforward. I mean, Joe, with the help of Julian and Frankie, do their best to recover the heart and get it back to its rightful owner. There were some really unique things that they did with the car that they never did before. For example, the Defender always had the grappling hook, but in every other episode, the grappling hook was used to reel in other vehicles during a pursuit or capture. In this episode, they actually shot the grappling hook vertically and used it to climb and then rappel up the side of a building. It's the only time in the 4 seasons they ever did that. Another thing I loved about this episode were the motorcycle stunts. Seeing those guys take headers off the front of motorcycles was just crazy, and I don't know how they didn't paralyze some of the stuntmen doing those practical stunts. And this episode almost reminded me of like a James Bond film, because the villains in this one had machine guns and missile launchers mounted on the front forks of their motorcycles. I mean, what can I say? This episode was just pure escapist fun from start to finish, and I loved every minute of it. And the third best episode of Viper Season 1 is Firehawk. Okay, so for people who are familiar with the show, they're probably noticing a trend on how I picked my favorite episodes. The episodes with the most impressive stunts and action sequences were obviously my favorite episodes of the show. There were only 1 or 2 episodes from Season 1 that you could notice they pretty much ran out of money when they were making it, and as a result, the episode had no action or stunts. The episode that comes to mind off the top of my head is Past Tense. It was more of a soap opera than an episode of Viper, and definitely one of my least favorite episodes of the entire show. Firehawk was the exact opposite of Past Tense. It was loaded with great action sequences. The name Firehawk for the episode was actually referring to an urban assault vehicle, and this urban assault vehicle was brought in by Lane Cassidy, who basically ran the criminal syndicate that controlled Metro City. Lane Cassidy brought in this ex-con, former police officer who had an axe to grind with Julian Wilkes, who actually designed the Defender. Basically was out for revenge and used the Firehawk to just put the Defender through absolute hell with a bunch of cool car chases and explosions, and just a fun episode. One of my favorite sequences of Viper happened in this episode when an electronic jamming device is launched into the Defender, and Eric Van Hook, the villain of the episode, actually takes control of the Defender and uses the car remotely to try to run down and create vehicular manslaughter with the Defender itself. So it was kind of cool watching Joe Astor being chased by his own car. Kind of gave me flashbacks of the old Stephen King movie Christine, or the Knight Rider episode Chariots of Gold, when Michael Knight and Kit actually have a confrontation, also under kind of a form of reprogramming. Here's a cool piece of trivia about Viper 2. Frankie's garage, the one that he basically serviced the police cars for Metropole, was also Han's garage from the third Fast and Furious movie, Tokyo Drift. And the second best episode of Season 1 is the pilot movie. Out of all the action TV shows that I grew up with, I think the Viper pilot movie is probably one of the strongest pilots I've ever seen. The pacing was really strong. There's a lot of action. That last 20 minutes of the episode is just non-stop car chase, and it's just amazing. The thing that I really appreciated about Viper was it was a little more gritty than most shows made around cars. The typical TV shows made around cars like Hardcastle McCormick and Knight Rider and Dukes of Hazzard were produced for the 8 o'clock time slot, and they would water them down because they knew kids would be watching them. They didn't really depict, any type of serious violence, and they avoided showing blood, and they didn't have much of a body count. I don't even think they ever killed anybody on the Dukes of Hazzard. It was a different type of car show for Viper. In the episode, the villain, Alec Conner, he actually kills a couple people, specifically Joe Astor's girlfriend. When they do it, it's pretty intense. She's standing in the window, and she just gets absolutely obliterated in a home bomb. They completely, turn the house into a fireball. That's just not something you expected, so it was kind of really shocking. And I remember vividly when the show came on, the TV Guide at the time, when they did the review for the TV show, they used for the headline, "Violent Viper is more like a comic book." And I can sort of see that, considering there was a comic book adaptation that came out a little after the show that DC Comics made for it. And, they made a big deal about the violence, but if you had watched Airwolf in the 80s, Viper wasn't, anything different. I mean, they were killing people on Airwolf probably just as much, if not more, at Viper, but somehow Airwolf got a free pass. The thing about the pilot movie is it does have probably the best visual effects of the entire first season. They spent way more money doing the morphs in the pilot episode, and you could tell. I think the pilot movie had like a budget around 8 or 10 million. So they spent a lot more on the pilot movie than, the typical Viper episodes. I mean, don't get me wrong, the morphing between the RT-10 Roadster to the Defender still looked great in the later episodes, but they had calmed it down a little bit, and the show's weekly budget for an episode was like $1.5 million, where they spent I think 8 to 10 million making this pilot episode. So they definitely had more stunts in the pilot, and I do think Alec Conner is probably the best villain that they had for the entire show, overall 4 seasons. I mean, I think Lena for maybe season 3 and 4 was really good too. But, overall, Alec Conner is just such a sadistic villain. But the cool thing about it is, even though he's really evil and mean, the Jason Carter, the actor who played him, is just so wildly charismatic and everything. You're kind of rooting for him, even though he's the bad guy. And it's just because the actor is just so good at what he's doing. And the best episode of the first season of Viper, in my opinion, would be Ghosts. I was just talking about my favorite villain of the first season being Alec Conner from the pilot episode. Well, they decided to bring him back, and he's just as sadistic and vicious as ever. There's just a lot of great story arcs for this one. The A story is pretty straightforward. They bring back the big baddie from the pilot movie, and he's got a major axe to grind with Joe Astor for putting him in jail. And the B story is actually just as compelling because, Julian Wilkes, who actually built the car, is getting frustrated that Joe is always kind of rushing in to save him from peril. In this episode, he kind of comes to terms with their friendship. There's one great scene where Julian's family is actually kidnapped by Alec Conner and held hostage at his house. And while Joe is unavailable, Julian takes a stand and actually knocks Alec Conner out from his wheelchair, and Conner goes flying over a balcony, and it's pretty epic. So like I said, the whole episode is wild. The show went really dark at the end too, because Alec Conner, instead of being sent to jail again, he goes full kamikaze and drives off a bridge. And because Joe is deploying the grappling hook on the Defender, he almost takes Joe over the side with him. So it's just an incredible episode. I've never seen anyone do a car stunt like that, where they were hanging the 2 cars over the edge with a steel cable. One of the other iconic scenes of this episode too is I've never seen anyone just willy-nilly throw grenades out a driver's side window for a car being pursued from behind. So there's a lot of iconic scenes in this episode, just very memorable, and I've probably watched this particular episode 100 times and worn out my old VHS tape. Just absolutely loved it. The other thing too that I like about it is because it builds on the pilot episode, I used to sit down and actually watch the pilot episode and then goes back to back and treat it almost like a miniseries. So just an expansion of the pilot storyline was just incredible, because you can actually get like 2.5 hour episode almost of just Viper, and it's all one continuously long story. So that's why this is my favorite episode. Thanks for watching my top 5 episodes of Viper Season 1. If you enjoyed this top 5 picks by Movieland, don't forget to like and subscribe.